Hey, this is lecture 5 of Philosophical Aesthetics 3 Central Problems, and this lecture is called How to Read a Philosophical Text. Now, philosophy can't be done without reading. You need to engage with the ideas of others, and often the way you engage with those ideas is through the reading of texts. These texts are often long and difficult, and there are very specific strategies that you can apply to make philosophical reading more rewarding, to get more out of it, so to say. And I will tell you some of these strategies in this lecture. So I will do the following. We'll first say a little bit about what is so special about reading philosophy. Because reading, of course, happens in all kinds of university disciplines, in all kinds of fields and branches of life. But there are peculiar things about philosophy and reading philosophy. Then I will talk about a couple of different modes of reading. You might be surprised, but there is not one single way you can read a text. There are many ways, and it's good to know at least a couple. And then I will talk about the role of questions in reading. Questions in philosophy are absolutely central, and so are they in reading philosophical texts. And I will end this lecture by giving you a list of reading questions that you might want to use in approaching some of the reading that you will do on your course and in your studies. Now, probably you will already have discovered this, but reading philosophy is very slow and time-consuming. It takes a lot of energy, and sometimes it can be quite tedious. So it's very important that you don't waste that time, so that you try to use your time efficiently and try to use your energy efficiently. Philosophical texts tend to have distinctive features that demand a very specific approach to disclose them or to open the text up for you. A philosophical text typically has an argument at its center. The argument of a philosophical text is not, as in most other forms of writing, a mere means to an end. So it's not simply a way of convincing a reader of a conclusion or a theoretical outlook. So the argument in a philosophical text is, in a sense, much more central to it. It's not a device. It is really the subject matter of the text itself. It is really what the text is about. It's where the action is. So this is why reading a philosophical text often means reconstructing an argument. And when I talk about an argument of a philosophical text, I am thinking of the main argument, but also all the sub-arguments and maybe objections or counter-arguments that an author discusses. So it could be a whole network of arguments that you find in a text. And understanding exactly how these arguments relate and how these arguments work is the process of reconstructing an argument. And often you will find, if you want to read a philosophical text carefully, that is exactly what you need to do, to reconstruct all these arguments and their relations. But it's not always true that you need to read a philosophical text in that very careful, detailed way. And this is important to keep in mind. So maybe the most obvious approach to reading is simply to sit down and read an article or a chapter or a book in full from beginning to end and move on to the next article or book when you're done. Now, this is typically not the best use of your time, and it will also not allow you to cover a lot of material. It's very difficult to read, say, 6 books in this very, very detailed way, where you go through the entire first book first, and then you start with the second and you read the entire second book. It's very hard to absorb any information in a meaningful way if you do it that way, and it will take very long to get through that list of books. Moreover, this approach to reading tends to be rather passive, and that's not really helpful if you aim to remember things or you want to retain the information that is there. So I think that improving your reading skills is important, and it should have 2 aims, or at least these 2 central aims. 1, better time management, and 2, it needs to ensure a more active engagement with the text. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. So I want to look at a couple of different modes of reading that I use, but I think that might be helpful for you as well. And I will talk about 4. And they will be organized in order of superficiality, so to say. So we'll start with the most superficial one, and I will end with the most detailed one. So the first one I call the quick glance. So you look at an article or a book or a chapter merely to find out something basic, such as what topic does it deal with, or which examples are discussed by this author. And by the end of a quick glance, you will have a good sense of whether the article is relevant for you, and if and how you should approach it. So it really just gives you this little bite of what is going on. It gives you a sense of the topic, a sense of, I'm probably interested in this or not. And it gives you a sense of how you should proceed, whether you should put this article aside immediately or whether you want to know a little bit more about it. And if you want to know a little bit more about it, you're going in for what I call skim reading or superficial reading. So here you read quickly through the different parts of the text to find out what view the author advocates. So what is the main claim that the author makes? What is their main argument? And by the end of such a skim reading or a superficial reading, you will have written down a couple of notes and keywords of the things that you have encountered. So you might have written down keywords to do with the argument, the examples that the author discusses, keywords to do with the central questions or topics. Maybe the author refers to other people, and these might also end up in your list with keywords. So you have a very rough sketch of what kinds of things you can find in this article. Often you want to know a little bit more about a text. So often this skim reading or superficial reading doesn't really help you if you want to engage with the text in any way serious. The best way of getting a good sense of what's going on in a text is what I call following the author's reasoning. So you read the several steps of the author's presentation in order to get a good idea of how the author's train of thought, as developed in the text, proceeds. So what is the complete argumentative narrative in this text? So by the end of it, you can summarize this train of thought in your own words. And then there is a very detailed or engaged way of approaching a text. Often you will find that doing this is limited in focus to a specific portion of the text. So maybe you're just interested in the main argument as it happens on, say, page 4 and 5. Or maybe you're interested in this specific objection that this author develops against this other view. And this is what I call detailed analysis or reconstruction. So you have already read the text before if you want to do that. You already know a lot about the text, but now you need to go back to understand precisely how the author argues for a certain claim. And so you spend a long time reconstructing one of the arguments you found in the paper, for example. So by the end of this exercise, you will have a reconstruction of the argument with markers of any steps that are still unclear to you, or maybe pointers of things that you want to develop more or think about more. Being aware of there being different modes of reading is really important if you want to approach texts in a more constructive way. Another thing that is absolutely crucial in reading is the role of questions. The way I've outlined these different modes of reading already makes clear that asking questions of the texts is very, very central. Asking questions guarantees an active engagement with the material because you're reading in order to answer a question. And your reading task is done when you have answered the question. So reading becomes really this activity of finding answers to your questions instead of just absorbing information in a fairly passive way. Asking questions also allows you to recognize what is relevant for you and what is not relevant for you when you're reading a text. So if you read a text with a question in mind, some bits of the text you can dismiss quite easily as not being relevant for the question that you have, whereas others might stand out as being particularly relevant. So you will give yourself a lens or sort of selection criteria when you read a text. For example, if you ask yourself, what is the main positive argument of this article? Which often is a very good question to ask. You can often ignore the sections that deal with rival views or with objections. So it might be that 50% of the argument you can suddenly set aside if you read it with that question in mind. Asking questions allows you to generate question and answer pairs. And these are just combinations of the question that you asked when you started reading the text and the answer that you came up with. If you write them down together, you've got a very, very good note for that text, something that you can come back to and read and immediately understand for yourself. Because these question-answer pairs are much more intelligible as notes than simple phrases or keywords. Now, to close, I want to give you a list of reading questions. And these are the questions that I often use when I read articles, and I think they might be useful for you as well. So I've organized these questions in 3 categories or stages. The first stage has a lot to do with what you could call the metadata of the text. So really understanding who wrote the text, how long is it, where was it published, those kinds of things. And then the second category is really about the substance. So you really want to engage through question and answer with the main ideas, arguments, and philosophical significance of this text. And then the third group of questions is really about yourself and how this text relates to your understanding and maybe to the other things that you've already read or are interested in. So let's have a look at this first set, which I called the first glimpse. You can ask these questions, and when you ask them, answer them on a piece of paper. Again, write down the question and the answer. It shouldn't take long, but it really gives you a very valuable set of notes. What kind of work is this? Is it an article, a book, a chapter, a lecture? How many pages? Who wrote it? What is the title? And based on the title, what do you think the paper is about? And here you are asked to give your first intuitions on the basis just of the title, what the topic of the paper is. How many sections are there? So here for the first time you glimpse through the paper and you count the sections. And you will notice that some sections are longer and shorter, and you will say, well, so many sections are there in this paper. In which section can I find the heart of the argument? Here you need to do some searching. Probably you can find some signal words. The most important thing, I argue that. So you look for those signal words and you see, okay, so I think in section 4 I can find the heart of the argument. That was the first glimpse. Now you sit down to read a little bit more carefully and more in detail. And I call this mining, searching, and scanning. So again, you're not really doing a close reading here at all. You're using questions to look for very specific bits of information. And once you've found that information, you've answered the question and you can move on. So what is the central claim defended? And I would say try to answer this in a paragraph so that you give a little bit more content. Often you can find this if you just looked at the conclusion of the article. So you browse to the conclusion of the article and you look up, can I find the central claim that the author defends in this conclusion? If you can find it, you're done. You've got an answer. You write it down. If you don't, you have to look a bit further. Maybe it's in the last section of the main part of the text. Maybe you find it in the introduction already. Maybe you need to search a bit more. Once you've found it, you write it down and you move on. Who is the main opponent? Is the author disagreeing with someone? Who is this? Is this a real author? Is it an imagined opponent? Once you've got the answer, you move on. What is the main argument? Now, this is maybe the most tricky one. And again, it's best to answer this in a paragraph. So here you are really going to look for the main line of argument, the central argument in the paper. And probably you need to read longer bits and stretches of text in order to answer this question. You don't have to reconstruct the argument yet. So even if it's just a rough approximation of the motivation for the main claim, that's enough. Does the paper make a negative or a positive argument, or both? Again, so identifying what kind of argument this actually is. Is the argument meant to motivate a certain claim, or is it primarily meant to undermine the belief in some other claim? Does the author consider objections to their main argument? Often you will find that an author splits the argument for the claim and then responding to objections. If you found that split, you can just count the number of objections and you write down how many. And then you move on to what I call the network placement, which really is a little bit more about you. So what was new to me in this article? See if you can answer that. What did I not yet understand? Was there something that was difficult, something I really need to look into more carefully if I want to understand this? What seems useful to remember? Was there something in this article or this chapter or this book that I really shouldn't forget because it's relevant for my essay, my exam, my studies? What other articles did I read that made a similar point or covered a similar topic? When should I read this article again and more carefully? So decide for yourself what the relevance of this paper or article is for you. Is it immediately relevant for you to understand fully what is going on? Then you should probably read it immediately if you have time. But maybe this is also an article that should wait, because maybe it is better first to get a more general picture of a certain discussion or a certain topic by, say, working through the entire reading list. And only then selecting certain key articles, because by that time probably you're able to identify better which articles are the most important ones, and sit down to read those more carefully. Probably that's a better way of using your time than simply to start reading the first article from the first page all the way to the end and then move to the next. Now, this list of reading questions is open-ended, and as I said, these are the questions I tend to use. Pick from them the ones that you find most helpful and supplement them if you want to use other questions. But the important thing is that you need some reading questions whenever you open a text. And those questions are also going to decide whether your reading is going to be merely superficial or very detailed. So settle on these questions before you start reading, and you will see that reading becomes probably a little bit easier and a little bit more structured. And most importantly, you probably have a better sense of when you're done reading. It is namely when you've answered the questions that you set yourself.